Thanks, Cliff. And we do love Bridges International, and we love being partners with them and working together. I want to just take a moment as I begin my sermon this morning and just talk a little bit about this building. And we don't talk much about this. I wanted you to know many of you who are sitting here gave sacrificially so that this building could be constructed. And when we moved into this building, we knew we needed revenue from several places. We had a building that we sold. We knew we would take on a mortgage, but we also knew we needed to raise money. So we entered into a capital campaign, and in that campaign, we had a goal of raising $2 million. We had a consultant who worked with us through that process, and he said, if you get 90 to 95% of that goal, you should celebrate. That's probably what you should expect. And so we set a goal of $2 million, and through the generosity of you and God's abundance, we raised $2,185,000. And later, we invited people to join in with us who weren't a part of the original campaign. We called it Finish Strong. And we raised an additional $445,000. And honestly, I hope in the next couple of weeks or a couple of months to make an announcement about another great act of generosity that's going to continue to help our mortgage be even smaller. And so, first of all, I want to say thank you for your generosity. And secondly, I want to say that because it fits exactly in with what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks. We started a series last week called An Abundant God. And in this series, we're exploring this idea that we have this abundant God, and that because God is so abundant to us, we can be generous with others. And so the result of that are things like this building, or people's needs being met, or it's not just about money, right? We talked last week about the abundance of forgiveness that we can give to people that don't deserve it. We talked about how we can give time to people and when they're going through grief or struggles. We discovered that God has abundance and that our generosity has a headwaters. Last week I talked about the collector stream in my neighborhood that only really runs when there's rain. It's been running a lot this summer, but it normally only runs when there's rain. And it dries up when the climate changes or when the temperature changes and there's not water coming down out of the sky. And our generosity is not like that. Our generosity is rooted in the goodness of God. And like the headwaters of the Mississippi, it fuels generosity through us to others in amazing ways because we serve an abundant God. We looked at 2 Corinthians chapter 9, and we looked at verse 8, among other verses. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 8, Paul says, and God is able to bless you abundantly. There's the abundant God. So that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you can abound in every good work. So there's this abundant God who allows us to be generous in all kinds of circumstances, in all kinds of ways. And again, this isn't just about finances, but about blessing others and serving others and loving others. And Paul goes on in that passage to say, he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply. There's God's abundant supply, and increase your store of seed and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion, and through your generosity your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. So Paul laid out in this passage this idea that we looked at last week, that to be generous people, we need to believe that God is abundant, that he has enough for us to share. Then we need to sometimes do things before we feel things, right? That we need to sometimes, instead of just waiting until we feel like it, sometimes we need to take that abundance of God and share. So we need to forgive people before we feel like it. We need to be generous with our finances before we feel like it. We need to give of our time before we feel like it. We need to act on that, and then God begins to bless us, and that results in thanksgiving. So we are grateful for the opportunity to be generous. Even when it feels like people keep asking us for more generosity, we can't always respond to those needs, but we're grateful that God has given us enough love to share, some money to share, some food to share. And we're grateful that even though we can't meet every need, we serve an abundant God that his grace can flow through us. Generosity, we discovered last week, is about God's abundance, not ours. But last week, several times in my sermon, I said, yeah, but, right? Remember? Because I also used the analogy of a shredder. And I asked the question, have you ever been generous when somebody shreds your generosity? Have you ever given of your money and somebody uses it foolishly, or given of your time and it's not accepted, or you've done a good deed for somebody and you've served them and they've turned that against you. Have you ever forgiven somebody that's used that against you? And so we had this question of, okay, it's great to be generous, but what happens when our generosity is shredded? What happens when we give and it's not and it doesn't result in thanksgiving to God? So the question was, can generosity ever be bad? Is there ever an opportunity or a time when our efforts to help somebody can be a bad thing? And the answer is, I told you last week, I'll answer it this week, and the answer is yes. Generosity may not always be a good thing. For instance, there's a Florida man by the name of Kevin Shelton. He's nicknamed himself the Money Man. And he likes to go through malls and beaches and parks and hand out dollar bills. He will carry around with him $5,000 to $10,000 bills on his body. He actually rolls them up and like tapes them to his body. And he started taking actually armed guards with him because he realized he was kind of a target when you walk around with that kind of money. And he just hands out dollar bills to people. He says he doesn't know how much money he's given out over his lifetime, but he's gone out 17 times in New York and Chicago and Tampa and just hands out money. He has appeared on TV's Good Morning America, and he hopes his fame spreads. Listen to what he said. He said, "I get a good feeling, and yes, I'd like to be famous. I want people to know me for this. I want to be the money man for the rest of my life." And so one time, to sort of up his game, he announced that he was going to be at the mall. He gained a reputation by now. He announced that he was going to be at the mall in Florida. And he got up on the second level of a mall, and he got like a money cannon, like the T-shirt cannon. And he just started spraying money, dollar bills, as they floated down into the mall floor below. And there was all kinds of people that were there because they had gathered. And so they started fighting for these dollar bills. We're not talking about Benjamins here. We're just talking about dollar bills. And people were injured. 6 people had to go to the hospital because they were chasing dollar bills. I want you to listen to that story. And if in that story you heard 2 things. Number one, you heard how being the money man was damaging to Kevin Shelton's soul. That became his identity. He wanted to be famous for being generous. See, generosity can become very self-focused pretty quick. And the second, others were hurt. Like in this case, literally hurt because of his generosity. So generosity can be bad. Generosity can hurt others, and it can be harmful to ourselves. Generosity can become self-focused, and it can be about pride, and it can be about us and what we get out of the situation, and our best efforts to help others can be damaging to them. Some of you are aware of the phrase toxic charity. There was a book written a number of years ago now named Toxic Charity. There was a sequel called Charity Detox. We've asked many on our board and staff and leadership team have read those books at my request. And in that book, at the beginning of Charity Detox, near the beginning of that book, the author Robert Lupton says this. Now I want you to listen to this. This is Robert Shelton in real life, okay? This is sort of a quote about what Robert Shelton was doing, but listen to this. American churches are at the forefront of the burgeoning compassion industry. It's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Spending billions on dependency producing food pantries, clothes closets, service projects, and missions trips that serve mainly themselves and inadvertently turn people into beggars. Unexamined charity that fails to ask the hard questions about outcomes, only perpetuates poverty despite its best intentions. That's a sobering quote. That's a thought-provoking quote. That's a quote that says, charity that is constantly put through the shredder may not be doing anyone much good. We have to be careful that we understand our abundant God, and in our acts and efforts to be generous with others, we don't create more problems for our spiritual lives and more problems for others. So as a church, we're wrestling with the reality of this quote and this idea in our benevolence initiatives. And we're never going to solve it completely. And I can tell you in the next 20 minutes, I'm not going to bring all clarity to every issue on this subject. But I can tell you we have to wrestle with this. We have to ask ourselves, am I doing what I do for the good of the other? And is what I'm doing good for the other? Am I doing it for the good of the other or for me? And is it really good for the other? So how do we respond to an abundant God? With extravagant generosity, without being generous in a way that is damaging to our souls or harmful to others. Let's go back to the passage in 2 Corinthians 9. 2 Corinthians 9, Paul goes on, he says, this service that you perform, Paul was collecting an offering for the church in Jerusalem. So he's talking about that offering as this service that you perform is not only supplying the needs of the Lord's people, but is also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. Because of the service by which you have proved yourselves, others will praise God for the obedience that accompanies your confession of the gospel of Christ, and for your generosity in sharing with them and with everyone else. And in their prayers for their hearts, and in their prayers for you, their hearts will go out to you because of the surpassing grace God has given you. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. In this passage, Paul, I think, says three things about how to be careful about our generosity. First thing I think he says is that our service, our generosity, is a response to obedience. It's not a response to a need in us or them. It's a response to obedience. For people to be, if we're going to be truly generous, it has to be something that comes in obedience to God. The second thing he says is that it meets a real need. The church in Jerusalem was going through a real time of crisis. Let me tell you something about when your charity is almost never toxic. That's when somebody is going through a crisis. When somebody's life has been turned upside down, when somebody's home has been destroyed, when somebody is going through extreme grief, your time is never wasted. Your time is never toxic. Your forgiveness, your financial help is rarely toxic in those situations. When people are going through crisis, it's time for the abundant God to pour his blessings through his generous people. But if that house that you helped pour money into is still not reconstructed 3 years down the road, and the money has not been used for what it was supposed to be used for, and you begin to realize, hey, this isn't what, then that's when that starts to becoming toxic charity. But the church at Jerusalem was in trouble, and Paul was saying, let the generosity of God flow through you, Corinthians. There's a real need here. Be sacrificial, be obedient, and use what God has given you to help those who are struggling. And the third thing is it results in praise to God, not us. Results in praise to God. Generosity that's not toxic always results in praise to God. So let me give you a phrase. I gave you a phrase last week. Remember the phrase last week? If God is enough, I will always have enough. If God is as generous as as abundant as he says he is, as we believe he is, I will always have enough to do whatever he asks me to do. Here's the phrase this week. If God is enough, I am never the answer. I'm never the answer. Listen, friends, we know the Messiah, but it ain't us. No matter how much you think you're helping somebody, if you think you're the answer to someone's problem, then you're distributing toxic charity. If you think, if I don't hang out with this person, if you think you're never the answer. So it's a filter for us to process. What do I think I'm doing here? Am I solving that person's problem for them? Have I become their Messiah in my own mind? Are they so dependent on me that if I'm not there, they're going to fall apart? Then that's toxic. God is the only one who can sustain them. If God is enough, then we will never be the answer. Release yourself from the misguided notion that your generosity is the answer to someone's problem. It's not. You're not the headwaters of generosity. God's abundance is. You're not the pool where his generosity, you're not the lake through which his generosity pools up in. That's a scarcity mindset. We talked about that last week. You're the channel through which God pours his generosity. You're the one that he can use, but it's his grace that flows through you to the other. It's his forgiveness. Listen, it's his forgiveness that you give to somebody else, not yours. If you need to forgive somebody, the headwaters for that forgiveness does not originate in you. It comes because God has forgiven you, and now what are you doing? You're sharing that with somebody else. If somebody needs financial resources from you, they didn't come from you, they came from him. God is saying, can I use you as a channel to pour my financial needs into this person. If somebody's going through grief, you're not the answer. You're just saying, I'm here. I'm here because God has been with me in these kinds of moments, and I want to be with you in these kinds of moments. You're never the answer, but you can be through the channel through which his answer flows to someone else. Because God is enough, you will always have enough. So we don't operate in a scarcity mindset. And because God is enough, you will never be the answer. He is. So how do we make sure that we haven't made ourselves the answer? How can we process this and get really practical? Let me give you 2 questions that you need to think about when you're trying to decide, how do I step into this situation? What is God asking me to do? And I hope you're thinking of real situations in your life, whether that's financially helping somebody, financially helping an institution, or giving of your time, or just how to divide up your life. And let me say this before I give you these 2 answers, 2 questions. Make sure that with this sermon, you don't go too far the other direction. Remember last week the call was be generous, be generous, be generous. The call this week is make sure your generosity is not toxic. They go together. Because what happens with us as Christians, right, when your generosity has been shredded, you start saying, well, and we theologize it, right? We say, well, I don't want it to be toxic, so I'm going to hold on to it. Let me give you another little hint. You'll never get this right 100% of the time. I know I haven't. So give up on trying to say, I'm going to solve this problem before I be generous. Keep being generous. Work on being smarter. And here's 2 questions to ask yourself. Is my generosity about me or the other? It's a probing question. It's simple on the surface, but really process it. Is my generosity about me or the other? See, often our generosity is not about someone else getting better, but about us feeling needed. This is subtle. You're going to have to process this in your own life and how it may show up in your life. But am I doing this because I really see a need in somebody's life, or because I want to be the rescuer or the Messiah or the hero? So I want us to think about this metaphorically by thinking about t-shirts. Let me just tell you something. You can serve your community and not get a t-shirt. You get it, right? You understand what I'm talking about? When we as a church a number of years ago made an intentional decision to shape the way we do life as a church and to ask ourselves the question, if Connect Church were gone, would the community notice? And we said what we want to do is partner with community organizations, community partnerships, and serve them well. The question came up with, how do we make sure everybody knows that Connect Church is the one that's doing this? And the idea of t-shirts came up. Let's get t-shirts. And don't go home and get rid of all your t-shirts from all the places you've served, but we processed that a little bit and we said no. Because it's not about us. It's not about Connect Church. It's about serving. You can serve someone without getting a t-shirt. Here's another thing about t-shirts. So that gets to the motives, right? That gets to the motives. Is this, am I serving because, here's another thing. You can serve somebody and not get a thank you card, and it's going to be okay. You can serve somebody and not get recognition, and it's okay. See, so the t-shirts is this metaphor of this idea that I don't have to serve to get recognition. And here's a way, someone said this to me, a wise person, I heard this recently, and they were quoting someone else that I highly respect. They said, here's how you know if you have a servant's heart. How do you act when you're treated like a servant? How do you act when you're treated like a servant? In other words, when somebody doesn't give you credit, when somebody takes you for granted, when somebody doesn't respond the way you want to. That's when you know about your servant's heart. So you don't need a t-shirt. So t-shirts is a metaphor of this idea of just self-introspection, like, is this about me or is it about somebody else? But then the question is also about the other. So we also need to make, so t-shirts is a metaphor on the other end too. And so what we as Americans like to do is the stuff we don't need anymore, we send it to a third world country. And it ends up in these third world countries And it can become toxic in those countries. And there's all kinds of stories around this. So you can just Google toxic charity. You can hear all kinds of stories. And I've heard it around T-shirts, where T-shirts will flood a certain part of the country. And those T-shirts, given out of our best of intentions, end up flooding the market so that people who are making T-shirts in that country or textiles in that country lose their jobs because of a flood of compassion that's come in and hurt their economy. So when we think about T-shirts, we're thinking about, is it about what the recognition I get, and is what I'm giving good? So it's not just about T-shirts, right? It's a metaphor. Is this about me, and is this really good for somebody? Here's what I think happens when we really serve well others. I think relationships begin to be built. And I think when we serve well and we're generous, here's what happens. God begins to bless us as we bless others, but not necessarily with finances, but in other ways. I'll give you an example. When I went to Haiti in 1982, I hadn't preached yet. I was a college student. The only time I preached in those days was at the nursing home. Most of them couldn't hear me, which is a really good thing. It was a good thing for everybody. But I learned that's where every week I'd go out there and poor people suffered a little bit more than they needed to. But I had never really had a chance to be a pastor. And there was a guy in Haiti. His name was Pape. Don't know his last name. Maybe that was his last name. He was just Pape. And he was just an energetic, outgoing, wonderful man. And for whatever reason, of everybody in the group, Pape started calling me Mr. Preacher. And there were other ministry students in the group. He said, Mr. Preacher, how you doing today? And it was just so encouraging to me. And he began to speak into me something that I did not yet know existed. And he began to help. He was an encourager. And every morning he would say, Mr. Preacher, how are you doing today? And as I think about what I gained from Haiti, when I was in that trip in 1982, the thing that sticks out the most was not what I did for them. It's not that I came back saying, oh, I'm glad I don't live in Haiti because there's so much poverty. It was Pape speaking into me. It was a relationship that began to develop between him and I. So as my point there is that as I had invested, as I gave of my time to go visit them, there was this relationship that started happening. And it wasn't me thinking, here, Pape, you need something from me. It wasn't Pape saying, here, you need something from me. It was him and I having a relationship that gave strength to both of us. And I think that's what happens when generosity is not toxic. We start seeing people. We don't see them as our project. We don't see them as our ego boosters. We see them as people on a journey in life. Second thing I would say is my generosity giving dignity, or is it creating dependence? Is my generosity giving dignity, or is it creating dependence? So I know it's been around for a while. I'm slow, but one of my favorite scenes in The Office is when Michael Scott has somehow gone out and started his own paper company. And somehow he stumbled into success. And he had Dunder Mifflin by the throat. And they were ready to make a deal to get their company back, to pay them off. If you don't know the show, don't worry about it. They're sitting across the table. And Michael Scott is sitting there, and Dunder Mifflin is on one side of the table, and Michael Scott and his team is on the other. And Dunder Mifflin says, we're going to give you $60,000. Now, if you don't know the show, you know that would be like benevolence because they did not earn that $60,000. And Michael Scott said, in one of his rare moments of wisdom, he said, we don't need $60,000. We need jobs. If you give us $60,000 and we don't have a job, we're going to be out of work. That money's going to be gone in no time. 3 people, $60,000 doesn't last very long. We need jobs. And as I thought about that, you know what? People around us that are struggling, they don't need our charity. They don't need to be dependent on us. They need jobs. They don't need your forgiveness just so they can feel better. They need their life to be restored. They don't need your time just so they can continue to wallow in their grief. They need a helping hand to help them walk through that grief and to a different path. People don't need us to become dependent on us. They need a new direction. They need a next step. A generosity that makes a difference is generosity that understands what I want to accomplish here is not just help them stay stuck, but help them to move to the next level. If your generosity is causing people to be dependent on you, It's toxic. That's what Paul didn't say, I'm going to come back every year for the offering. He said, we have this one need at the church of Jerusalem. They need you now for this crisis so that they can get on their feet. And it says later that they will then someday bless others because they're in a different place. One advocate for the poor says, when you spend time with people who are living in extreme poverty, there's a consistent request. And it's not for more charity. It's not for more handouts. The consistent request is for a job. People in the developed world don't want to be poor. They don't want to be someone else's charity case. People that are struggling in your life don't want your pity. They don't want your sorrow. They want you to walk with them through their journey. Generosity is not about people becoming dependent on us, which is unhealthy for us and them. But generosity is sharing God's abundance with people in a way that gives them dignity and opportunity. So remember, if God is enough, we're never the answer. But we can be a part of the solution as he allows his grace to flow through us. Pray with me. God, we thank you. We thank you that you are enough. And because you are enough, we always have an abundance to share. Because you are enough, we can be generous with our time, with our money, with our forgiveness, with our wisdom, with our care and concern for people who are going through difficult times in life. Because you are enough, God, we can be generous. And because you are enough, we never have to be the answer for someone else's needs. Because you are enough, we can be channels, not collectors, not headwaters, but channels through which your grace flows into the needs of others. So God, help us to process this in a way that makes sense. Help us to take this into our own daily lives. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.